All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us for our second webinar in this short series. We're going to be getting started in just a few minutes, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to go over first. Like I mentioned, this is the second webinar in our short series. We are going to be having one more webinar focusing on career help and job search assistance later this week on December 4th. It's going to be a special Q&A session to go over any questions that we don't get to today, as well as to kind of just have an open platform for you to all ask your pressing questions. So don't miss out on that, and please feel free to sign up and share that out with anyone who you think might be interested. A link will be in the follow-up email that gets sent out. I also wanted to let everybody know that on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a control panel. Here you're going to have access to all of your audio settings as well as a question box, which you are more than welcome to use throughout the session and really encouraged to use. After the presenter is done with their presentation, we're going to be having a short Q&A session so we can discuss your questions or go into a bit more detail on some of the topics if you need. And if you ever have any technical issues, you can also use that question box and I'll be here to help troubleshoot all of that. And if those technical issues persist, don't worry, since there will be a recording that is also sent out in that follow-up email, so you can always review that at a later date. Now, back to the presentation. My name is Marcus Nebro. I'm a client services specialist with Tutor.com. I primarily work with our library partners. Most of you may be joining from or have heard about us through them. And in talking to a wide range of library partners, one of the things that I heard there was the most need for was job help in their community. It's no secret that in many ways things have been tough this past year, whether for those who are entering the job market for the first time or having to jump back in after a couple of years. So we wanted to do our part and kind of share our expertise to make that transition as easy as possible. And while many of you have access to Tutor.com through your educational partners, institutions, or libraries, a lot of the content that we're going to be covering today is just kind of great for everybody, regardless of if you want to use Tutor.com or not. So to introduce our presenter and get started, the presenter for today's webinar is going to be Rachel Eckman, who runs quality control for us on our back end, making sure that our tutors and students are having the best educational experience possible. She also has 5 years and hundreds of hours running resume and job workshops. So she is our leading expert in career services, and I'm excited to have her speak today and share her expertise. So I'll just let her take the floor.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and thank you all for joining us today. I am, as always, thrilled to be here and to be able to share this presentation with everyone. I hope that, as Marcus mentioned, this is part of a series of webinars, and I hope that many of you are joining us after having attended the first webinar in this series about resumes and cover letters. But please let me assure you that if you missed the first webinar, you will still be able to fully enjoy and understand this presentation. They are related, of course, and I might even be referencing some of that information over the course of this presentation, but I promise it will be in a way that you can still fully understand, even if you didn't attend the first one. So no worries on that. A little bit about myself. As Marcus said, I've got lots of experience doing presentations for students, educators, and employers on resume writing and online job seeking in general. I was a technician, actually, a mechanic and a technician by trade, and I retired. I left the tech field back in 2015 to work full-time in education. But I have been a teacher, a tutor, and a counselor in some capacity for the last 20 years. And so let's just jump right in. I always like to start off with a look at the current economy and job market. And this is because if we want to have a successful job search experience, it's important that we be prepared. And of course, the first step to being prepared is to know what we're getting into. Employment rates are still on the rise, but at a much slower rate than they had been over the summer. The uncertainty of COVID, of course, is still lingering, and that's something that employers are taking into consideration. And economists are predicting that at the current rates, it could take as many as 18 months or more for a full economic recovery. But that's not a negative thing. It sounds like it's a long time, but that's actually a good thing because that shows that there will be consistent increases in employment over the long term. And of course, the numbers will continue to climb as the industries adapt and recover. And one of the things that's going to come to define this current job market is the volume of career transitions that are going on right now. I don't know that we've ever had a job market that has this much career transition and crossover happening all at once. So this is definitely a state of transformation in a lot of different ways. And I talk about the unemployment rates a lot and I talk about the jobs and stuff, but this is just a little visual for you guys so you can see where we were hovering up until COVID in the unemployment numbers, and then there's that spike, right? There's that coronavirus April, oh my gosh. And now you can see that we've been steadily coming back down since April, right? And so things have slowed a little bit right now, but again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Things are starting to become more stable and more secure in the job market. And of course, a lot of change is happening. The thing that I want to talk about though, when we calculate unemployment rates, what they're doing, there's that formula down at the bottom of this slide. You take the unemployed numbers and then you divide by the total labor force. And by total labor force, we're talking about unemployed and employed added together, right? But the thing that people don't know about unemployment is that it is not actually reflective of jobs. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the current ratio of job seeker, of unemployed job seeker to job opening is 0.8. 0.8 is that ratio. That means that there are actually more jobs than job seekers. So that's actually a really good thing. If you're a job seeker right now, you are at a great position to find employment. And there's no doubt that remote employment is going to be the new standard in a lot of industries moving forward. And as a remote worker myself, I can tell you that for me, it's perfect. I love it. I get to be a stay at home mom and a working mom simultaneously, and it's amazing. But it's not without its challenges. There's a lot to consider when we're talking about remote employment. First and foremost, the competition is very often greater in quantity, right? Because the employer has the opportunity to expand their talent pool to across the country. So there's that aspect, but then there's also a lot of details that people don't necessarily consider. And there are pros and cons. You can live anywhere. You can often adjust your hours within reason to fit your schedule and to accommodate things that come up last minute. You save a ton of money on commute costs, of course, and on lunching out and certain things that you might spend money on more frivolously when you're employed out of the home. But then there are other things that you need to consider, like missing out on the structure of an on site job. There's workspace considerations, internet reliability, home office requirements. Of course, we have distractions, plentiful. And so before committing to anything in terms of online employment, and when I say committing, I mean before applying, before you even fill out an application for a remote job, I really recommend sitting down with your family, or if it's just yourself, sitting down with a pen and paper and going over all the pros and cons very carefully and making sure that remote employment is what's right for you. Here we go. Sorry about that. Considering how important a budget is, very few people do an actual budget. And so my question is, how can you really know whether or not a job is within your required income bracket if you don't really know what that bracket is? Basing your presumed salary requirements on what you've heard is the market standard, on prior salaries, or on desired salaries can actually be quite a mistake. Prior to filling out any applications, you should really sit down and do a thorough budget assessment and weigh all the factors that will be impacted by changing your job. If you've never used a cost of living calculator before, I always recommend trying this. You can access a variety of them online, and they all have different features, and they're usually free of cost. But the basic gist of what you're going to get out of it is this: they take your current salary and location by zip code, and then they tell you what salary you would need in other regions of the country to maintain your standard of living as it is currently. And you might be really surprised by some of the comparisons. And it does two things. Not only will it let you know how your standard of living is where you currently are and in your current salary bracket compared to other places and other positions, but it'll also give you an idea of where you want to be in your next job. And that's really what we want to find out. What salary do you realistically actually want to look for moving forward? And it's just great information to have whether or not you plan to relocate, and in particular, if you're considering remote employment. And I recommend a two-part budget system, and that this is something that you can incorporate into your job search. So the first part is, of course, the usual balance sheet. And then that's going to be your income to expense ratios, find out what your true monthly expenses are, and then what you'd be comfortable with in terms of salary. And it's very helpful to do this with 2 months of on paper checking account in front of you, because it just gives you a tangible look at what your finances really are. And it's very helpful in showing you something that I like to call the perils of digital banking, which is that people frequently have no clue how much they spend every month on things that aren't necessities and bills. So if you're sitting here and you're telling me like, okay, well, I make, $50,000 right now and I just can't afford a penny less. And then you sit down with your checking account statements in front of you and go over your budget, and you come to find out that you're spending $2,000 a year on Starbucks. Which I've seen happen, by the way, the realization, the shock and horror. You can actually kind of adjust your lifestyle to meet a job that you really want. So it opens up the opportunity for you to start looking at jobs that you love as opposed to the job you think you need. And that's not always going to result in a lower salary, but the point is that it opens up that window for you a little bit, and it gives you a little more opportunity. And then the second part of the budget calendar that I recommend is a bill pay calendar. And you can download these online also. And it's basically a numbered list from 1 to 31. And the idea is that you list every regular bill that you pay, the date that it's due, how much it costs, and how it's paid. So, for example, I might put next to the 5th of the month, my cell phone bill is due, it's $100, and it's paid by automatic withdrawal. So, this is a really helpful tool when you need to balance your checking account, when you need to see, like, okay, this is my balance right now, but how much is it going to be 3 days from now after my electric bill? And it's just something that really comes in handy because, again, having an effective budget management system is going to be the key to identifying the correct bracket for your employment consideration. The other thing that I like people to do before they sit down and start filling out applications is to do a solid, honest qualifications assessment of your qualifications for a job. That means if you have a bachelor's degree, then you should probably be filtering out positions that list a master's as a requirement. You're going to be filtered by the ATS anyway, so why take the time to fill out that application? And if you have a master's in progress, though, you might be able to feasibly put that on your resume, add it into your qualifications, and apply for some of those positions based on your upcoming degree. So having all of that information in front of you in a sort of a checklist is really helpful to help organize your job search. Now, I'm not saying that you should never fill out a reach application, but those should be kept to a minimum. What do I mean by a reach application? Well, I once filled out an application for NASA. Now, I knew that there was no way that NASA was going to hire me. I was not qualified, but I just loved the idea of applying, and it was my way of inserting a little bit of lightness and fun into my job search. And I figured, I can always just say, well, hey, I was almost a NASA astronaut, right? What the heck? And when I was rejected, I was not surprised, and it didn't mean anything. It was harmless. But that was a one-off situation. It's not always harmless to do things like that, because filling out job applications, as you may already know or might soon find out, is tedious and time consuming. And you don't want to waste your efforts and your energy and your time on applying for jobs that you're really realistically, if you're being honest, unlikely to be offered. And even if it's an expected rejection, rejection can still be a little bit difficult to take. So swing for the fences every once in a while, absolutely, but don't get too carried away with it. There's always a reason for changing jobs. Sometimes it's salary, sometimes it's hours, upward mobility potential, relocation, organizational culture. The list goes on and on. Bottom line, we never leave a job just because. That's why it's so important to research an organization before applying for a position. Imagine, if you will, that you've left your current place of employment because you found yourself unable to go any further in terms of promotion and professional development. And then you take a position with a new organization, only to find that they've recently filled the next higher position to yours, and it'll be 10 years before there's another opening. This is why being informed about the organization to which you're applying is so critical, because not knowing is how so many people end up with multiple short-term employment stints on their resume. And that, as we know from going over resumes, is damaging in terms of being hired for that next position. Short-term positions are what's called a screen out factor and can often get your resume pulled from the pile because they view it as problematic for a long-term potential employee. And so you want to avoid, and so now this is where we're playing chess and not checkers. You avoid having those short-term employment stints by being very, very well knowledgeable about an organization before you go on board with them. Do that research and use the resources that are available. There are so many. Google searches and employment forums and job boards, they can provide tons of important insight into an organization. They'll give you information on things like salary, frequency of raises, organizational culture, growth opportunities. All of that is available with the click of a button. Just make sure that you read some of the more negative reviews with a grain of salt, because keep in mind that often the people who post more frequently are those with an axe to grind. So don't just read 2 negative reviews and toss an organization out of your filter. Consider all the information and use it to form your own opinion. But the point is, just get the information, because the information is going to be what's putting you in a powerful position. Now, according to Glassdoor.com, only 50% of online applications, once begun, are completed. Then you take the fact that over 80% of job seekers, once surveyed, have described the online job search process as time consuming, stressful, and difficult. So all of this kind of paints a little bit of a grim picture of the online application process. Basically, today, what we're going to do is we're going to go over some things that will help to mitigate that stress and that difficulty and create a more positive experience when you're looking for your job. And the number one thing that I advise here is to avoid application fatigue. So let me explain what application fatigue is. Filling out dozens of applications, seeing jobs that you think you'd be perfect for, but you're setting yourself up for what you may perceive as rejection when it really may just be circumstantial. Okay. Before you fill out an application, you want to check when it was posted. Very often, HR is a little bit slower to remove an online job posting. Maybe they're concerned that their candidate might leave within the first 90 days, so they don't want to repost the application. They'll just leave it up just in case, or maybe they've forgotten about it, or maybe the position may or may not be in flux at the moment. They've frozen hiring temporarily. Whatever the reason, very often job postings remain posted longer than they arguably should. So if it's weeks or months old, there's a chance that the company is already either stagnant in their hiring process or inundated in applicants and going through an interview process whilst we speak. So the likelihood of your getting an offer or even really receiving contact from one of those organizations drops dramatically the longer the position has been posted online. The other thing you want to look at, if you can, is how many applicants have already applied for the job. And some sites will tell you that information. LinkedIn is one of them. They'll say, okay, this is how many applicants have already been. So sometimes it'll tell you 150. Once you're in that triple digit realm, the likelihood of your resume getting visibility with that employer gets lower and lower and lower by the number. But LinkedIn will tell you, hey, you can be within the first 25 applicants, or you can be in the top 10. So the closer you are to the first handful of applicants, the more likely you are to get looked at by that employer. Strategy is key here. The amount of effort and strategy that you put into your job search is going to determine not just your success in landing the job, but your long-term job satisfaction. Because again, it's not just landing the job, it's landing the right job. If you want that perfect job, you're going to have to work for it. The online application process can seem redundant and tedious, and that's because it is. And I can't sugarcoat that for you. It is. It's redundant and it's tedious. But there are ways to maneuver so that you can be as effective as you can through the process. First, you need to create a list of your must-haves. These are the things that you absolutely cannot compromise. For starters, we've already completed our effective, really, really well laid out budget. So we know our salary bracket. So now you've got your salary requirements laid out. Those are things that you can't compromise. You know, hours or something for you, healthcare, childcare, location, basically all of the things that would be a deal breaker, even if the perfect job were to land in your lap and say, oh, but by the way, and those are the things that you need, your must haves. Then I would also recommend making a list of your preferences. So don't put them on the same list. Don't confuse your must haves with your preferences. So I must be within this salary bracket and I must have this much opportunity for healthcare for my family. But I would really like a job that's within a 15-minute commute of my house. So certain things like, the preferences, those are things that would be great to have, but shouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker from that perfect job. And you want to take your two lists and you want to balance them before you fill out any applications. Another thing I think you should do is set a limit of how many applications you're going to fill out per day and per week. And I always recommend a schedule. So let's say, for example, on Monday, you're going to comb through the job boards and you're going to find all of these different job applications. And then on Tuesday, you're going to vet these applications, these positions that are posted. So you've Monday you've found 30 jobs. Tuesday, you're going to research your organizations, you're going to balance the positions against your qualifications, your must-haves and your preferences. And then on Wednesday and Thursday, you're going to fill out applications. So before Wednesday and Thursday, you know how many applications you're going to fill out on Wednesday, how many you'll fill out on Thursday. And then I recommend giving each job a rating in a hierarchy, if you will. So like these are your top tier jobs, these are your top 10, and then these are the next level positions. And then these are the, well, this could work, but like it's really not my first choice position. And that way, it helps you to prioritize your applications. So on Wednesday, you start out fresh out of the gate. Your first application that you fill out for the week is going to be for your absolute hands down favorite job, and then so on down the line. And by Thursday afternoon, you're going to fill out the applications for the lower rated positions only if you haven't met your maximum already, right? And then once you've got this whole process down, and that's not a must use schedule. It's just an example, but you have to do whatever works for you. But once you've got your system down, then you want to keep a tracker of your applications with dates, position titles, and notes. One of the things that I hear, unfortunately, often from my job seekers is, I don't know. So I'll often ask them how many applications they've filled out. I don't know. How long has it been since you applied for this particular job? I don't know exactly. How long was the job posted before you applied for it? So you can see where I'm going with this. That these are all things that you really should know. Be sure that you create a tracker for your applications that will document at a minimum how many jobs, so you know how much you're applying for, which ones, of course, when you submitted the application, and what the position was for which you applied. Because you'd be horrified at the number of times people apply for the same position multiple times without even realizing it. Imagine putting all of that work, and it is quite a bit of work, into applying for a position that you don't realize has been posted online for 3 months and there are 250 applicants ahead of you. And then what's worse is you apply for it again a couple of days later. So no wonder your job search is so frustrating, right? And I also recommend giving your applications a shelf life. If you don't hear back within 5 business days, follow up with an email or a phone call. If you don't hear back again within another 2 weeks, put a note on your tracker and move on, and assume that you won't be contacted by that employer. It's also very important to consider how much the digital component factors into job seeking in today's market. In the year 2000, around 20% of resumes were submitted online via email or job posting. Right now, in the current market, over 95% of resumes are posted online or emailed. Nearly 500,000 resumes are posted on Monster.com weekly. And that's just one of many job seeking forums. And the transition from what we used to have to this online job seeking standard is not without its challenge for a variety of reasons. Again, knowing what we're up against is going to be the key to our success here. Over 90% of recruiters have hired someone that they found through LinkedIn. And lots of estimates claim that as many as 60%, maybe even more, of open positions are filled through networking without a job posting even hitting any of the sites. So professional networking has become huge in today's job market, which means you should really have a professional networking profile. I think everyone should have a LinkedIn profile. And you should take the time to make it a good, strong profile. Your LinkedIn profile should first and foremost align with your resume at all times. When you update your resume, you're updating your LinkedIn, and vice versa. You never want to have contradictory information, because I can almost guarantee that when you apply for a position, they're going to check your LinkedIn before they contact you. So don't raise any red flags by having conflicting or contradictory information between your resume and your LinkedIn. Also, be very careful about making your LinkedIn page social media in nature. So everything on your LinkedIn should be 100% professional, and that includes your photograph. You really want to stick with a headshot, plain background, as nondescript as possible. Also, there is a section in LinkedIn. Once you've got your profile all polished and your resume polished and everything's matching and really sharp looking, there's a section on LinkedIn that asks if you are job seeking and do you want to be contacted by recruiters. And you want to make sure that you open that up, turn it on. So that way, when recruiters are going into LinkedIn and they're pulling basically like a database query from LinkedIn and saying, okay, I'm looking for a person who has, this experience in accounting and this much background and this type of education. And let's say you meet all of those criteria, but you don't have your recruiter profile turned on, they're not going to be able to pull your profile. LinkedIn won't give them access unless you say, yes, I would like to be contacted by recruiters. So make sure you touch that button. Another thing you want to consider is, what are your skills and qualifications on LinkedIn? Don't go skills happy. Don't just click every single skill like, yep, I do that. You don't want to get into the hundreds when you're talking about your skills and qualifications. But anything that you have identified as a keyword on your job applications and on your resume should also be under your skills and qualifications on your LinkedIn profile. You want to have a whole full circle of reiterating, yes, these key strengths are things that I can bring to the table. So pay close attention to your professional networking digitally. One of the biggest challenges that I always have to talk about during these presentations is the ATS. It's something people just don't know enough about, and it really is one of the most important factors in the resume and online application process. And when I say one of the most, I'm probably being really conservative there. It's probably the number one factor because you have to get through it to get the job. The applicant tracking system, or the ATS, was invented. It's a computer program, and it was invented in the late 90s when online job boards started popping up in 94. And the name is deceiving because applicant tracking system gives us this image of a computer program that is processing and logging and recording job applications and spitting them out to the employers in a nice organized fashion, and that is not what it does. The truth is that online hiring systems are set up for for elimination, not selection. The ATS was created for the Fortune 500 companies initially. And what it was supposed to do was solve the problem of thousands of applications and thousands of resumes that they were never able to filter through. What it ended up doing is filtering out over 75% of resumes before handing them off to the actual hiring managers at an organization. So you need to know how to not be eliminated in that huge 75% pool. And that all starts with creating your ATS ready resume, but there's a lot more to it than that. So this brings us back to that incomplete application data. ATS systems will automatically screen out an incomplete application. So it is very critical that you double and triple check your application, that you've completed all the fields prior to submission. And again, applying for only jobs that you're qualified for is a key factor here, because if you're not meeting the benchmarks that are set up in the ATS system for qualifications for that position, it's going to be an automatic screen out factor. Another thing that I want to caution you against is applying for multiple jobs within a single organization or within organizations that share a parent company, because that information will be visible to them. And so again, that goes back to making sure that we've researched our organizations prior to doing applications. Organizations that share a parent organization, smaller companies within a larger corporate entity, will have a single HR that disseminates employment down to the organizations. Maybe not 100% of the time, but most of the time. They'll share a single HR. And that's for corporate fluidity. And there's a lot of legal stuff that goes on with that as well. But the bottom line is that even though you're applying for different positions at different companies, they're all going to the same person. And so any contradictory information, even accidentally contradictory information across those applications, will be a red flag there. Another thing to consider is whether or not the positions for which you're applying within the different organizations look scattered, or if they make you look on track for your career progression. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, are you applying as an administrative assistant at one organization and the head of HR at another organization, or the CEO? Why is there such a huge disparity in the level of positions for which you're applying? That's another red flag to the employer. So make sure that that information is accurate as well. I really am qualified for this, and be careful about applying for positions that you're really overqualified for, because that's actually a screen out factor as well. Another thing that you want to be sure for your ATS filtration process is that your information on your resume matches exactly what you're putting on the job application. What do I mean by that? I don't mean on your resume you have years for employment and then the job application it asks you for months and years. That's okay. What I'm talking about is a different email address, a different phone number, a different home address. Actually, I usually recommend leaving your complete home address off of your resume, but if you have it on there, make sure it's the same as what you're putting into the job application. And to that end, make sure that your driver's license matches all that information in case they ask for a copy of it. Conflicting personal contact information, believe it or not, can be a screen out factor with the ATS as well. Conflicting employment information. I always recommend not going back more than 15 years, 20 at most on your resume with your employment information. But for some reason, people tend to do that on their resume and then put all kinds of other stuff, like everything they've got goes into the job application. Don't do that. If you have 4 employment blocks on your resume, then that's what you're filling out on your application, no more and no less. So make sure that all of that information matches, and that will give you a greater chance of getting through that screening process on the ATS. Another thing to be cognizant of is digital communication. You know, digital communication is really tricky, and for good reason. The lines of professional etiquette can be easily blurred, particularly when it comes to texting, right? And this is, of course, exacerbated by the dramatically increased volume of communication that we have in the digital world. We tend to experience just a lot more back and forth. And of course, that lends itself to shorter, quicker, less really taking the time to do it right style communication. People tend to become careless. We pay less attention to our writing. We rarely proofread. And worst of all, we fall victim to the trap of using inappropriate shorthands or overly familiar language out of habit because we no longer have that separation between professional communication and personal communication. When we use the same device, right? So it just, our minds don't turn on and off into professional mode. So be careful of this. Every instance of communication between yourself and a recruiter or potential employer has to be 100% professional, whether it's by phone, email, text, or networking sites like LinkedIn. So the most exciting and potentially nerve-wracking part of the application process is, of course, the interview. This is the desired outcome, theoretically, of every application, and it's the last hurdle to get over before you get offered a position. There is a lot to consider here. But one thing that I really like to remind people is this. If you have no intentions of taking the job, don't go on an interview. This isn't something people think about all the time. It does happen quite a bit, though. People want to go on a practice interview at something that they may consider to be a throwaway job, or maybe they just don't feel comfortable declining the offer of an interview, or maybe they're afraid they won't get other offers. Bottom line is that interviewers experience fatigue also. They're going to have a very different outlook on their first interview as they will on their 10th. Your actions here are going to impact other job seekers, and we're all in this together. So let's say you get the call for an interview for your perfect job. Do you want the person who interviewed just prior to you to have been doing it as a practice interview? Maybe the employer just went through all the trouble of interviewing them, extending an offer, waiting to hear back, getting rejected, or maybe even ignored by the applicant. Now the mindset of that employer is completely different walking into your interview. So courtesy and professionalism really extend to all aspects of the job seeking process. And we really want to remind ourselves that this is a team sport, right? There's no I in job seeking, even though I think technically there is. But let's say that you get that call for the interview and it is the job that you want. And you already know the cardinal rules, right? Of interviews that should everyone know by now, the more obvious ones you hear all the time. Dress professionally, research the company, have your questions prepared, take notes. Then there are some fewer talked about things that are equally important. Never contradict your resume. This is huge. And of course, it all starts with not lying on your resume, but beyond just that, and this is, you'd think not something I would have to say, but it I do. You got to remember what's on there. You know, a lot of my job seekers have had to go to great lengths to recall or even to retrieve some of the dates and information on their resumes. And then they slap it on there and they forget all about it again. But this can be very damaging in an interview because the last thing you want an employer to think is that you made up, don't remember, or worst of all, don't care about your work history that's on your resume, because the resume is the basis on which you were offered the interview. So make sure you know it by heart, inside and out, before your interview, and be prepared to answer questions about your resume. And you also want to pay close attention to your verbal and nonverbal presence in an interview. Interviewers are human beings, and human beings are prone to bias. No matter how objective we try to be, bias creeps in. And the unfortunate truth that we don't like, but we have to acknowledge, is that every other qualification being equal, an employer is going to hire the candidate that they like better. So everything you reveal about yourself is an opportunity for an employer to potentially allow their personal bias to cloud their evaluation of you, even if it's subconscious. Don't distract them from the main point. You're the best person for the job. The average length of an interview is 40 minutes, and yet over a third of employers surveyed indicate that they know within the first 90 seconds if they're going to hire a candidate. The things that they say most often when reporting nonverbal cues that disturb them are handshake, posture, fidgeting, playing with hair, and poor eye contact. So those are your top criteria that you want to be mindful of. And when it comes to online interviews, they're of particular importance in today's job market because even if you're not applying for a remote position, there is still a chance that you'll be asked to conduct an online interview. My advice for online interviews encompasses all the general interview stuff plus a little extra. And unfortunately, not unlike digital communication, people tend to become a little too comfortable during online interviews. They exhibit behaviors that they would never consider if they were in an office. Don't make this mistake. No eating, no chewing gum, no smoking. Don't even drink during your interview. It can feel tempting because you're at home or you're comfortable, but don't distract the interview. Everything you do should be geared toward presenting your qualifications and answering questions. And I always recommend wearing full formal attire, even if you're online. And that includes shoes, because your entire mindset will change when you are head to toe dressed professionally. Your posture will improve, your tendencies and your behaviors will naturally lean more toward professional. And another thing I caution against is using a mobile device. If at all possible, avoid mobile devices. Have a laptop or a computer, use a plain nondescript background, something that's not busy or distracting. Don't have any posters in the back for the employer to be reading while you're talking. Limit background noise as much as possible. And don't ever, ever, ever do an interview in your car. There are a lot of common interview questions. A lot of them get recycled throughout interviews over the years, but studies have shown that the number one most frequently asked question across all fields of employment by all interviewers is, tell me about yourself. It's just the most common icebreaker question. And it also happens to be the most treacherous because this is where people make this huge mistake of right off the bat in the first 90 seconds of an interview. Remember those first 90 seconds, revealing personal information unnecessarily. It is first of all, illegal for them to ask you personal information, and it's really, really recommended to avoid divulging anything unnecessary, unrelated to the job. Marital status, children, family information, sexual orientation, political affiliation, age, ethnicity. None of this stuff has any place in your job interview. So make sure that you're keeping your communications professional in nature. For some reason, people also tend to badmouth their current or previous employers during job interviews. It's usually a product of, so why do you want to leave your current job? Maybe they feel compelled to justify the job search, or they want to reassure the employer of their willingness to change jobs. Maybe there's another reason, I'm not sure, but it's not advisable. Trash talk will not buy you any points with a future employer. As a matter of fact, it might harm your chances of employment. What will earn their respect is to conduct yourself with professionalism and integrity. So be prepared to answer that question in an appropriate manner. Again, start to finish. This is why I'm qualified for the job. So, why do you want to leave your current job? Well, I have had some invaluable experiences with my current employer, and I'm so grateful for all the opportunities I've had with that organization. But your organization is able to provide the training and the growth opportunities that I'm really seeking for my long term goals. So there you have it. You have demonstrated yourself as a professional. You have paid homage to your current or previous employment, and you've now steered the conversation toward the employer thinking about your long-term commitment and your long-term goals, and back to that professionalism. And a lot of people forget that following up is still a critical part of the job search. There are several opportunities to follow up, of course, during the application process, but the most important is after the interview. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but once upon a time, after going on a job interview, it was considered customary to actually send a thank you card and thank the interview for their time. Of course, we barely send regular mail for any reason these days, but I do recommend a thank you phone call or email, if not note, after the interview. So within 1 or 2 days max of the interview, you want to reach back out if you haven't heard from them already. Thank them for their time. A great segue for the call is, oh, I was just calling to say thank you and to see if you need any additional information or documentation, because you really want to press them in that direction, right? Because documentation typically means what? That they're going to extend you an offer. I'll tell you, a good follow-up can make or break an employment opportunity, because it can take an employer who's got your resume and 1 or 2 or 3 others on their desk, and they're kind of really going back and forth, and then bam, they get this awesome phone call from you thanking them, and you just nailed it because of that. So you can swing an undecided employer into your favor with a really strong follow-up contact. And one of the worst things that I think of digital communication has done to our communication these days is what I call the ignore factor. Remember, this is all about professional networking and your professional reputation. So being non-responsive to an employer who offers you a position can harm your professional reputation. You have no idea who's in that employer's professional network. One way to reduce the number of declines is to limit your applications again, and then your interviews to only the positions you really want. People tend to start out their job searches in a little bit of a frenzy, and this leads to a lot of unnecessary application. But if you restrain yourself and you start off slowly, it'll also limit the number of times you need to reject an employer. A handful of quality applications is always preferable, and you'll yield better results that way. But when you do have to decline, and it might happen, just be sure that you are polite and professional. Thank them for their time. Reiterate that you appreciate the opportunity. Be honest about why you're declining, and then try to find a way to keep the door open for communication in the future, because now you've just expanded your professional network in a really positive way. But let's say it's a job that you really want. This is where we come full circle. So now we go right back to our must-haves list. Has anything changed since you made that list? A lot has happened in between, right? So is everything still the same? Does this organization still meet your criteria? Yes, the employer was evaluating you, but you should have evaluated them too. What do you think? Having met their hiring people, having gone through the process, do you see yourself there? Remember, this isn't just your next job, it's also the next block on your resume. Is it going to be a strong block should you change jobs again? Will you be there for at least a few years? Do you see the potential for professional development? Is it a gap job? Is it a starter job? Consider the chess maneuver of this position. Is this going to be a strong point on your resume? Or is it going to be like, I just need to get through till tomorrow? And either one, I can't tell you if it's right or wrong. It's a very personal decision. What I can stress is the need to evaluate all the angles and make sure that the job is right for you before you accept. And my standing advice to all job seekers is always just stay positive. Don't let the job search get you down. You are in a stronger position than you think. You just have to organize yourself and get it done and use the resources that are available to you. Learn from your mistakes, appreciate the experience, and don't lose faith that the right job is out there. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Marcus.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we do have only a couple minutes left until the end of the webinar in total. So I will try to get to some questions in just a second. I did just want to remind everybody, again, we are having one more session on Friday, and that's going to be strictly Q&A. So feel free to bring any of your questions if we don't get to them today, or if there's anything that comes up throughout the week that you want to go over, that would be a great kind of way to get that information. Now, as for questions, probably the number one thing that I end up seeing both in my personal life and when speaking to different people has to do with employment gaps. So one person's asking specifically, back in the early 90s, they were working and then they kind of took a very long gap to become a full-time parent. How exactly do you go about addressing that in interviews and resumes? Is it all right to put that job information from the early 90s on there, since that kind of goes past your 15 years or so limit?
It's a great question. And as you said, it is really one of the most common. So, employment gaps are something that can be mitigated, but of course, in some situations, you really just you can't make it go away, right? The thing that I would emphasize is on your resume, you want to say something in your summary to the effect of returning, enthusiastically returning to the workforce, or something that frames you as someone who's really just ready to jump back in with both feet. Also, you want to mention that you have all this prior experience, but i I would be careful about putting jobs from the early 90s. Now, it depends on how long your gap is. Let me back up. So, depending on how long your gap is, you can absolutely, if you have nothing from 92 until now, then absolutely whatever work experience you have, because you don't want to make it look like you have none, right? And then what you would do is, again, make sure that you're putting that on the resume, that you're enthusiastically ready to go back into the workforce. I would put some element of professional development, whether it's education, online courses, certifications. So if you don't have any of those things, I recommend getting them. And then the other thing that I would recommend is, whether or not it's a requirement, submitting a cover letter, something that you can kind of use to showcase the reason for having such a long employment gap, and why it's not a problem and why they shouldn't be concerned about it, because those are your really golden opportunities. Cover letters are your opportunity to really just kind of sneak that in there. And in terms of ATS screen out factors, it might not necessarily, like, especially if you've got nothing, like if it ends at 92 and then you're not putting anything since then it might not even pick it up, to be honest.
Awesome. And then we, in a similar vein, kind of had a question, and I was personally curious if you're at a specific company for, let's say, 26 years, 30 years, and then you now have to find another job for whatever reason, kind of how do you address that? Because then you only have really this one position that maybe you've done a ton
Hmm.
of different things for and have a lot of experience in different kind of fields from that one position.
Yes.
But how do you kind of go about that?
Also a wonderful question. And these are resumes, truthfully, that I love to write. these are these are actually really great resumes to write. And this puts the job seeker in a really strong position. First of all, of course, that 20-year, 15, 20-year rule doesn't apply if you've been at the same job for longer than that. So put your true working years. More than likely, after that length of time, you have held, if not multiple different positions at different echelons, then at a very minimum, you've done a lot of development of skills and qualifications, right? So that's where you separate that one job block into smaller categories. So you'll have a main header that says, I was with XYZ Corporation from 1992 until present. And then you'll go down and you'll say you'll instead of having your different jobs, you'll have your different position titles. So if you can picture it, it'll basically be a main header job title, and then you're going to put, hiring manager, and then prior to that you were the floor manager, and then prior to that you were the sales clerk, and prior to that you were the stock clerk, or whatever your progression through that organization was. And if you don't have position titles to lean on, then what you'll do is you'll organize it into kind of achievements. So projects that you've worked on, and then you'll organize them chronologically, things that make you stand out within that organization. Because obviously, if you've been with a company 25, 30 years, you were doing something right. So there'll probably be tons of development stuff to put on there. And so that's actually a really great quality to have in your resume.
Awesome, thank you. Now, this is kind of more, I believe, for part-time jobs. And I know that when you mentioned being in an interview, not to give away any voluntary information that might kind of bias the interviewer. But would you go about, or how would you go about letting the interviewer know that you're currently holding a job and looking for a second one, if that's something you would even bring up?
Unless they ask, I wouldn't. You're not obligated to inform unless it's a company that has any kind of a non-disclosure or non-compete clause involved in the employment, which that's really going to be the minimum. That's very unusual. But unless it's something that they ask, then I wouldn't bring it up. So think about it though from this perspective. If you've submitted your working history and if you've submitted your resume, then it's going to have that employment information on there. Whether or not the employer assumes that you're going to leave once you've gained employment from their organization, you don't care. That doesn't affect you. If they directly ask, are you planning to quit your current job when you come on board here? Then obviously you'll have to address it. But what you'll want to do is frame it in a way that says, no, I'm not going to leave my employment, but yes, I am going to give this job my full attention. So something I would recommend to the effect of, I don't intend to immediately leave the organization that I'm with right now, but I am really excited and really looking forward to coming on board with your organization and to what the future might hold with this position. So you'll basically kind of take away that closed, no, I'm not leaving my job. Make it an open end. Make it something where the employer could say, oh, so in other words, like once you decide you're really happy here, then you'll leave your other job. Or once you decide that you're stable, then you'll leave. And again, whether or not you do, whether or not they think you do, really that's not your concern. You focus on, this is why you should hire me at this place. Don't worry about all that other stuff.
That's very fair. And now for our last question, I see someone bringing something up that I was always curious about and was kind of the main frustration point for me personally, you mentioned how you should follow up after a couple of days, and then setting aside that job position after a week or two of not hearing back. So, when you're applying for a job, what is the kind of time range you can expect for someone to actually respond to you, and say like, "Hey, we want to move on to the next step"?
There's no time range, and that is frustrating. Every organization is different. To be honest with you, I have had interactions with organizations that get back within that same day. I have had job seekers who've called me after an interview a couple hours later and said, "Oh my gosh, I literally got to my car and they had called me already." And then there are employers that will contact people 3, 4 months later after they've already taken another position. So that part, unfortunately, is always going to be frustrating because we can't control the organizations and we can't rein them in that way. And so really it's going to depend on their HR. It's going to depend on how many applications they're willing to look at, how many interviews they're willing to conduct, and every employer is going to be different. My advice though, just to keep yourself, because again, you can't control the employers, but you can control your own job search, and you can make your own job search positive and fluid and well timed and well executed. So don't delete them off of your tracker. Just put a note, 3 weeks, haven't heard back, followed up on this date, and then just move on. So mentally push them to the side. But if you're still not committed to another employment 3 months down the line and they call you, go on the interview or take the position. Absolutely. I just don't want people hanging on to hope for weeks and weeks and months and then feeling that disappointment later on down the line and then allowing that um mental kind of cloud to impede the rest of their job search. That's really what that's all about.
Yeah, that can always get really tough when you're holding out hope for this one position that you would love so much and
Exactly.
just hoping and praying that they'll get back to you eventually.
And you know
But
what? Very often, that one position that you love so much that you're hoping and praying for may not have been the right position anyway. And while you're looking over there, there's this other wonderful opportunity right around the corner.
exactly. All right, so I think that's really all the time that we have today. Again, sign up for that webinar coming up later this week. You'll get a link for that in the follow-up email going out tomorrow. And then if you have any questions that we didn't get to today or that maybe when reviewing the webinar come up, feel free to submit those in the webinar and we'd be happy to go over those in a bit more detail. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining and have a wonderful rest of your day.